The first paper in this session is by Junko and Armin Mester, and it's titled Supersized Units.
Yes, so one trend in prosodic theory for many years has been various attempts to restrict the inventory of constituents to units of certain sizes, particularly of ideal size. And in particular, supersized instantiations have repeatedly been declared non-existent. So, for example, the heavy light trochee for Latin and other cases, or the super heavy syllable for cases like Japanese by Haruko Basono, and many other attempts of that kind. Now, in OT, such units violate often high-ranking markedness constraints and lead a marginal existence, so are not totally ruled out, but they are sort of, the idea is very rare. Today we want to show that data from English, German, Danish, and Japanese sort of illuminate different factors that lead to the systematic appearance of such units. So, basic outline, I want to talk about the heavy light trochee in a number of languages, and then the main part of the talk about super heavies. Okay, rhythmic harmony is a well-known concept, and there will be much more about this in the talk by Megan, but there is a sense in which trochaic feet are best when their two parts are equal in quantity, as first, in linguistics brought into the discussion by Bruce Hayes. So, preferred are the equal trochees, two lights and one heavy. Dispreferred, the heavy light trochee. This contrasts with iambic feet, which are better when they contrast in quantity. So preferred is the light-heavy iamb versus other instantiations of it. There are many cross-linguistic consequences of this kind of iambic trochaic law. So we find cases of trochaic shortening, which are surprising, given the naive idea that stressed syllables always lengthen. So English, Fijian, Hawaiian, a number of unrelated languages show this. On the other hand, we have iambic lengthening in a fair number of languages, studied in detail in Bruce's stress book. So the heavy light trochee is sort of an interesting concept because there are a few stress systems that can only be captured with strict Moraic trochaic feet, two lights and one heavy. Examples include Kyrene Arabic and Fijian. So that a string of heavy light has to be passed as in the first line, not in the second line. You get the wrong stresses. This is a well-known fact, whether the secondaries are audible or not, as mentioned by Bill. On the other hand, many other languages, so in particular right to left trochaic systems, can in general equally be analyzed both with strict Moraic trochaic feet and with classical QS trochees, so light, heavy, and heavy light. English, Latin, they work either way. Difference is assigned foot structure, but identical stress positions. And so as you can easily see, both of these kinds of parses arrive at the same prominence positions. So one can say, well, Moraic trochaic feet can do it all. So what's the status of the heavy light trochee? The evidence from prosodic morphology suggests that in a number of languages, including English, German, and Danish, there is good evidence that heavy light trochees do have to exist. And I want to go over some of these cases. A very simple case arises in English. The heavy light trochaic foot, for example, the nominalizing suffix o that attaches to mostly disyllabic words, which have stress on the final syllable, so arrival, denial, refusal, trial, all of these, but the preceding syllable has to be stressed, so no abolishal or beneficial are possible. And many formations like that, many in recital, refusal, rehearsal, a formation very productive into the 19th century. Natural to understand this as a foot-based requirement, O appears as the weak member of a trochaic foot. But once you say that, it implies the heavy light trochee for forms like trial. That has to be part of the system. The O suffix contrasts very interestingly with the ic suffix, which forms adjectives, which also requires stress to fall on the preceding syllable before the suffix. So photograph, photographic, astronomy, astronomic. Difference is first that the stress can change. So it can attach even if the stress is not yet located on the preceding syllable, it changes. And secondly, its structure changing, often the arising heavy light trochees are optimized to light. So cone, conic, cyclone, cyclonic, etc. So we see in a system that has the heavy light trochee, there's still optimization going on. So other cases of the heavy light trochee in English are really quite frequent. ER attaches in general to words of 1 foot, but handsomer then must be a foot, heavy light trochee. Rama, as in cellorama.com, attaches to a foot, and that foot can be a heavy like foot. So table rama, skater rama, roller rama, bowler rama are all like that. So these are prototypical examples. So the heavy like foot is clearly established in the system. An extensive case of this we see in German. And because we have a good criterion for diagnosing feet, which comes from German schwa. The fact is that different from schwa is not just excluded as the nucleus of a stressed syllable, as in English. It must, in addition, be the weak member of a foot, so occupy the tail position of a trochaic foot. So that's a subset of all the unstressed positions, which also include the unfooted occurrences. So we can state a constraint like foot, tail, schwa. Obligatory position for schwa, this position in a trochaic foot. So schwa needs another syllable to depend on inside a foot. So it's a dominated constraint, sometimes violated, but many situations where it's operative. So little background stress system of German, which is relevant. So word stress limited to the last 3 syllables with very few exceptions, basically like the Latin stress rule with some variations, as in Dutch or English. So basically word final super heavies are stressed more so than in English. So bandit, athlete, attentat, alarm, Abtei, all these so diphthongs, closed syllables attract stress, and long vowels followed by one or more consonants. So word final consonants non-moraic, and so super heavies count as heavy, and heavy syllables count as light in the familiar way. Standard analysis, foot is trochaic, the weight to stress principle, and non-finality as the dominated constraint, and finally rightmost, align the main stressed syllable rightmost in the prosodic word, and then taking some examples like tremolo versus hibiscus, and you see antepenultimate stress when there is no heavy final, but hibiscus, the heavy final, attracts stress to that position. And papagay, you get final stress because the diphthong attracts it there. That's the basic system. There are some issues, behavior of open syllables with long or tense vowels in German and Dutch. Question, do they attract stress or not? People have gone back and forth on that, but basically for the consensus for recently, for purposes of the stress system, open syllables with long vowels behave as light. So diphthongs are heavy and as are closed syllables. This is sort of the standard analysis. It doesn't really matter for our point here, but we have to adopt something, so that's what we adopt. So basically, antepenultimate stress, when the penult is open and has a long and usually tense vowel, underlined in these examples. So alibi, exodus, albatross, lexicon, antepenultimate stress. Pattern is not exceptionalist, but a strong statistical tendency. So penile stress is also found. So you find forms like aroma, bikini, casino, but much less frequently. So that statistics is important for our argument. So choice is lexically determined, but the antepenultimate pattern is considerably more frequent. So if we look at some data, so taking words with the following properties, trisyllabic monomorphemes, last syllable doesn't contain schwa, because I will later talk about the schwa cases. And last syllable also not super heavy. If we look at these cases, then distribution of antepenultimate versus penile stress, and the result is that 60% antepenultimate. So that is the default with a final full vowel. This is interesting because words ending in a schwa syllable, opposite tendency. When the last vowel is not a full vowel but schwa, then overwhelmingly penile stress. So in a sense, schwa attracts the stress. So apotheose, methode, tapete, acacia, locomotive, that's the thing. And also something like locomotive sounds very weird. It's not just non-existent, it's really weird. So it's things are very clear. So 93% stress is on the penult, and very few cases on the antepenult. And schwa located right after the stressed syllable. And the most violations are apparent, actually something like obscure compounds. So there's a special story about them. Okay, so foot-tail schwa is really active in German derivational morphology. So, for example, names for inhabitants of countries, two allomorphs, schwa and er, and Nana Furhop has shown in great detail that lots of things happen in order to maneuver the schwa into the post-stressed syllable in these cases. Typical forms are Ägypten, Ägypter, Bangladesh, Bangladesher, but then Herzegovina, Herzegovina, Indian, Inder, Japan, Japaner, not Japaner. So basically always post-stress. So that's really a big generalization about these. Same with the schwa version of it. Afghanistan, Afghane, so Denmark, Dane. Observation is often also very idiosyncratic things like Guatemala, Guatemalteca. But whatever happens there, schwa is post-stress. So we want to add a constraint, the foot-tail schwa constraint, to our little system located above non-finality. And so if we contrast like tremolo with a full last vowel and the schwa word citrone, then you see the contrasting behavior where the foot-tail schwa attracts the stress to that syllable citrone like that. Okay, so foot-tail schwa is a dominated constraint. There are words that violate it, particularly things like trockener, dryer. But these are morphologically derived words where basically an or ident stress constraint forces the stress not to change. So these are the exceptions that exist. So there is schwa outside these dispositions, but whenever that is not the case, schwa is basically in a trochaic foot after the stressed syllable. Lots of independent support for this. So last vowel, when it reduces to schwa, you predict, in some cases, stress should shift, and that's what you find. So genesis, but genese. Viola, viola. Diastole, the Greek word, but diastole in common pronunciation. Borrowings, which shift stress to the pre-stress syllable. Mormon, but they're mormone. Shaman, but they're shamane. Iroquois, but Irokese. So motivated by that schwa in the last syllable. Systematic shifts in the plurals for certain cases. So normally no shift because of our or ident constraints, but cases like doctor, doctoren, stress shifts to the pre-stressed syllable. Professor, professoren, tractor, tractoren, and many, many words like that. Okay, now this is of interest because it gives us an indication. Somehow the schwa indicates foot status for certain sequences, and we see this means lots of heavy light trochees. Farbe, Bombe, Glaube, Ende, Erde, Hilfe, Reife, Folge, etc., all heavy light trochees. So basically large parts of the German lexicon are like that. Okay, so we see that within these systems, the heavy light trochee is really fully established and is even when the stress location itself doesn't tell us where the foot boundaries are, this tells us where things are located. And the last case, I will only just give the highlight before Junko turns to the Japanese heavy syllables. The Danish stød is of interest, and we will hear more about this in the afternoon and Scandinavian from Paul Kiparski. Just a little remark, there is good reason to think at least diachronically, but maybe also synchronically, that we can think of the stød as a characteristic, a melody, a high-low tone, associated with a monosyllabic foot, a heavy syllable. So this is the kind of syllable that gets the glottal accent in Danish, not a foot that is disyllabic. So Thomas Riad has argued this, Paul Kiparski for Livonian, and there are a number of indications like that. So the relation between the glottalization and the tone is in any case an historical one, maybe a synchronic one. But the relation to the heavy syllable with a sonorous second mora is very clear. But that means then again the stød is an indicator of foot structure. And so we get monosyllabic feet basically with stød, disyllabic feet without stød. So ban, the word for child, has a stød, but childish does not have a stöth because it has two syllables. It very systematically like that. That's a big standard rule for the Danish stöth. But again, it's a window on foot structure. And since Danish words that are heavy light do not carry a stöth, that means they must be feet, disyllabic feet, not heavy syllable being a trochee followed by an unpassed syllable. So heavy light is part of it. So all these examples must be trochees and are stöthless. And at this point, I will stop and hand things on to Junko.
So oversized units like the heavy light trochee are one case of what is not the default. And now I'm looking at syllables in Japanese. Super heavy syllables is one such case. So universal syllable theory countenances light monomoraic syllables, heavy bimoraic syllables, and super heavy syllables, trimoraic or even heavier, as a marked option. Japanese is no exception, so overwhelming majority of words are composed of maximally bimoraic syllables. In the core vocabulary, the super heavy syllables are very restricted, so native items only in morphologically derived forms like haitte, with a gerundive suffix, totta, past. But in Sino-Japanese items, there are not. So there's a strict size restriction up to bimoraic. They're either monomoraic or bimoraic. However, these super heavy syllables are abundant in the peripheral vocabulary, namely in Western loans, with a long vowel and diphthong followed by a moraic nasal. So tone is super heavy, patan, sign, and so on. Okay. And such recent loans, there's actually a lot of these super heavy syllables. And an online dictionary, just by doing a search on them, shows that there is no reluctance in adopting such loanwords. So this is the katakana form with the moraic length plus moraic nasal, if you search that, as well as in, which also creates a super heavy syllable. We get these forms like aitan, autoban, adobarun, afternoon, etc. And also in forms, airain or design, tendaroin, and so on. And there's really a lot of these forms. So there's apparently no reluctance in borrowing such super heavy syllables. But as we said, the super heavy syllables in native words, there are no super heavy syllables. And only by morpheme concatenation and derivation do we find such super heavy syllables. So there are these verbal inflection cases, denominal adjective cases, and noun-forming cases that I'll just go through one by one from here. In the verbal derivation, if the root is CVVC and the suffix starts with a consonant, then we actually have a super heavy syllable derived like totte versus the short one with totte, okay, or haitte, hair, H-A-I-R, that means CVVC creates a heavy syllable, super heavy syllable. And does not seem to be any general tendency to shorten the vowels of super heavies like totte, which remains distinct from totte, the other minimal pair. Another case where a super heavy syllable is formed is by the suffix poi, P-P-O-I, geminated P, and attaching to nouns like kodomo, child, kodomo poi, childish. So because it's a geminate P, we get a heavy syllable at the end, kodomo poi, or onna poi. But if the final syllable of the noun is heavy already, then we get the super heavy syllable, chiho poi, star poi, pop star like. Or the cartoon figure Doraemon with a nasal, we get also Doraemon poi with a super heavy syllable. A similar case is the ko suffix with a geminated k, which literally means child person, but is actually a demonym, the person from a certain place. So Edo, the former name of Tokyo, becomes Edoko or Pariko. But of course, if the final syllable is heavy, like Sendai, we get a super heavy derived Sendaiko, as well as Rondonko or Berurinko. And ween, which already has a super heavy syllable from the beginning, would have basically a quarter moraic syllable, weenko. okay, as derived with the KKO suffix. These trimoraic syllables, even though quite abundant as we saw, has had a controversial status. Several researchers like Kubozono and Vance have argued that some or all of these trimoraic syllables should be analyzed as split into two syllables, namely a monomoraic syllable and a bimoraic syllable, as shown there. So schematically, a syllable that looks like a super heavy, like rain, should be split, is the argument, namely into ra and in. Now, the split syllable analysis, therefore, always results in an onsetless second syllable. Okay. And what's the evidence for such split syllabification? Well, native intuitions about syllable boundaries, possibility of vowel articulation in slow speech, and patterns of accentuation. And the patterns of accentuation is what I would like to focus on. The generalization is follows the form is that accent falls on the initial or head mora of a syllable. Okay. So, for example, the antepenultimate accent rule discussed first in Martin, Macaulay, etc. We know that accent appears on the antepenultimate mora of loan words or nonce words of kinds which have no lexically determined accent, like asparagus. Notice that it's different from the accent in English, asparagus. Okay. But on the initial mora of a heavy syllable, like erebeta, it shifts one mora to the left from strictly antepenultimate position, and that is, the argument goes, that it's because accent can only fall on the initial mora of a syllable, that's why it moves to that position. Okay, and in inflected verbal forms, accent does fall on the initial mora of a heavy syllable, so kaite, or of a super heavy syllable that we saw, haite, and so that seems to be a general pattern again. So the split syllable argument that we should split the syllable, the premise is that pitch accent always falls on the initial mora of a syllable. Observation, in some super heavy syllables, accent does not fall on the initial mora, but on the second mora. And those cases in particular must be that this is not a single syllable, but two syllables, a monomoraic CV plus an accented bimoraic accented VC syllable. Okay. So, for example, that such a case is found in Raingawa, and pointed out by Haruo Kubozono, or Spain-jin. Okay, so the accent on the second vowel, E, for Raingawa, argues that it is not, Rain is not a super heavy syllable, but should be split into Ra-in-gawa, or Supe-in-jin. Because if it was a super heavy syllable, it should have gone to the first mora, like Rain or Spain. Okay. Now, but if we look at all these cases, there is some conflicting evidence. For example, for ko. For ko, accent appears immediately before ko, so edo, edoko, pariko, but also sendaiko, as well as rondon-ko. Notice that it goes on the moraic nasal. For sendaiko, this would be evidence for a split syllable analysis. We would have sendaiko with accented e as the initial mora of a syllable, rather than the super heavy syllabification. Similarly, but look at berurinko and rondonko. Are these also evidence for a split syllable analysis? Well, it would mean that the berurinko would be syllabified as ri-nk-ko. And this creates problems and also raises further questions. It's crucially necessary to admit this strange syllable type like nk with no vowel and syllable initial moraic nasal if it has to be split. Okay. And this is especially odd given that the nasal is otherwise always postvocalic. Takashi Morita in a recent paper has also provided further arguments against this split syllable analysis. Now, the questions are, if such moraic nasal initial syllables are indeed admitted, then why are other moraic nasals not accent bearers? So for Amazon-gawa, why not Amazon-gawa? Or Rain-gawa, why don't we ever get it on the n? Why can't they be split in this way, the syllables? Okay, so this means that another stipulation for super heavies is necessary. That is, they always split into a light plus heavy sequence, not into a heavy light sequence. But again, would just be a stipulation. So we think a better explanation is needed of why this is indeed the case. So reassessing the argument again, repeating it again. So if an accent does not fall on the initial mora of a syllable, syllabification should be modified so that it does fall on the initial mora of a syllable. That's the split syllable argument that has been given, so in these forms. The premise taken for granted here is that pitch accent indeed always falls on the initial mora of a syllable. So pitch accent always falls on the initial mora of a syllable. But what is the status of this assumption? Is it an inviolable constraint? It's just a high-ranking constraint, or a single constraint, or several interacting constraints. Now, if it is just a violable constraint, then the non-initial pitch accent in certain situations is expected to arise, and there would be no need to admit these strange syllable types like nk in Japanese. So the proposal is, and we'll give a brief preview here, is that we just have no regular standard syllable constraints of sonority sequencing, onset requirement, coda restrictions, and take the accent to be the tonal complex starred HL as in proposal by Pierre, Hamann, and Beckman, and many others, and have tonal markedness, alignment, and faithfulness constraints of various kinds, which we will see in a second. Okay. And that this A through C leads to actually a better understanding of the way super heavies behave with respect to accent rules, and also provides actually a window into some aspects of the typology of Japanese accents. So in doing this, we focus on one part, namely the compound accent, which has been the focus of intense investigation in Japanese accentology with many well-established generalizations, so it's a good place to start. So there's a difference, of course, between word compounds and phrasal compounds, but here the focus is word compounds with junctural accent. Now, the junctural accent is assigned at the juncture between compound members. Schematically, there's the arrow is where the juncture is, but it is realized as close to the juncture as possible, either at the end of word 1 or at the beginning of word 2. Okay. Short word 2s, so when the word 2 is only a foot, the accent goes on the last syllable of word 1. If word 2 is larger than 1 foot, then the accent goes on the initial syllable of word 2. And yes. So here's some examples. Word 2 is 1 foot, therefore it goes temuzugawa, kameraman, so on. Otherwise, on the initial syllable, namatamago, denki kamisori, and so forth. Okay? So as close to the juncture as possible seems to mean leftmost in the word 2. Of course, if it's leftmost, it's going to be initial syllable of word 2 as well as the initial mora, because it's the leftmost. So tamago versus Tokyo denryoku, of course it's initial syllable, but it goes on the initial mora, denryoku, or kaigai ryugaku. Okay? But when we are talking about rightmost in the word 1, it's always the last syllable, but not necessarily the last mora. So kuwagata mushi is indeed last syllable, last mora, but Tokyoto is last syllable, but not last mora. It's the penultimate mora. Oregonshu, again, last syllable, but not last mora. To show the productivity of this case, we take the example from Shu State Province with the American states, Utah-shu, Nevada-shu, Arizona-shu. This is to show the productivity. But also Bimoraic heavy final syllables like Kentucky-shu, Washington-shu, Hawaii-shu. Notice that this is only in compounds. In isolation, they have accent on different positions. For trimoraic final syllables, American state, there's only one, namely main-shu. But here, notice that it is a final syllable, but it's the penultimate mora. So when it's super heavy, it does not go on the syllable initial mora. And this is general, as can be seen by other forms or other place names with provinces, Isfahan-shu, Purebein-shu, and so forth. Okay. With other examples, not just shu, namely short word two, they behave similarly. And here are some other examples with short word two with super heavy examples at the end. Okay. So what this, the generalization is, within the rightmost syllable, accent appears on the final mora of a one-mora syllable, on the initial mora of a two-mora syllable, and on the middle mora of a three-mora syllable. Okay. So why is this this mixed pattern? It's the initial mora, but penultimate mora for these other two cases. So the usual question asked is, why are not all accents syllable initial if accent is supposed to go on the head mora? Okay. So why isn't it all initial? The usual answer is the one that we've already heard, namely the usual answer consists in denying that the rightmost syllable is ever trimoraic, so it would be split, therefore it would be syllable initial. Okay. But as discussed earlier just now, this means admitting strange vowelless syllable types like NK. We want to ask a different question, which is, why are not all accents syllable final, given that the junctural accent should be as close to the juncture as possible? Shouldn't it all just go to the end? Which then asks the question, for both the heavy syllable and the super heavy syllable, it is actually displaced ones. So rightmost junctural accent is displaced by one mora for the bimoraic and trimoraic syllables in this way. So this is what we think is going on, and that is not because of any special circumstances regarding heavy syllables or super heavy syllables, as has been argued earlier, but because of the bitonal nature of the Japanese pitch accent, together with the universal tonal integrity requirement, whereby tonal complexes prefer to have a single host syllable. So Pierre Humbert and Beckmann has argued that these pitch accents are a tonal complex composed of two linked tones, with a star high low, and the tone-bearing unit is the mora. So, and we assume a tone-by-tone linking of tonal complexes like ame, hon, standardly. And so the idea is that although the tonal complex is a structural unit, each tone is independently associated to tone-bearing units. This is actually contra Pierre Beckmann, who linked the tonal complexes as units, not tone by tone. So we'll see why we would like to argue that it is tone by tone and not each of the tones in the tonal complex must associate separately. So the gist of the analysis is that the pitch accent HL is right aligned with the juncture, okay? And this is aligned. This is why the starred high portion of the tonal complex appears on the penultimate mora of bimoraic and trimoraic syllables. For monomoraic syllables, the entire bitonal complex cannot appear on the final syllable, leading to misalignment. So only the high portion docks on the final syllable, leaving low to dock onto the beginning of word two, and is misaligned. The tonal markedness constraints, we have a tonal alignment, which aligns the tone to the juncture, tonal integrity constraint, which whereby tonal complexes must be hosted by single syllables, tonal crowding, or no moraic contour, so where a mora can only host one tone. And we're also assuming standard tonal constraints, like no skipping, no unlinked tones, no crossing, and tonal faithfulness constraints. Just very schematically, here's the bimoraic syllable aligned. The tones are perfectly aligned for the H and L for this case. It's not crowded, it's aligned, and the complex is hosted by one syllable. Okay, and in this, for this candidate, both the alignment and integrity are violated because the complex, HL complex, is not hosted by a single syllable. In the last case, it is hosted by a single syllable, but the tonal crowding, the no moraic contour constraint is violated. Hence, we get the form the first form. For trimoraic syllables, it's the same. Perhaps the second example is the more interesting one. Here, we see why the high tone does not go to the initial mora, because the tonal alignment is violated. It should be able to go to one further, like the first case. And hence, the answer to why it doesn't go initial is because of tonal alignment. Okay. For monomoraic syllables, we have actually a ranking argument, namely that tonal crowding is more important than the others, so that we actually do have violations of alignment and integrity, and it's not all on the one chain. There's also one more candidate like this, where the high tone might go to another syllable, and that is high ranking, high alignment ensures that high portion of the tonal complex is aligned to the rightmost syllable. So simple constraint ranking with the tonal crowding and alignment and integrity. Now, even though tonal integrity is low ranking, there might be other uses for it. For example, the antepenultimate accent rule might also be involved here, so where the shift to the pre-antepenult, when the position is the second mora of a heavy syllable, erebeta, the usual reason, again, given is the accent always falls on the initial mora of a syllable, but maybe this is the better answer might be a tonal integrity, whereby you really want to have the complex go onto the tonal complex go onto a single syllable. Crucially, this analysis means that a single linked tonal complex like the one proposed by Humbert and Beckman don't actually offer an explanation. These constraints, like for alignment, integrity, and crowding, only make sense when the individual tones in the tonal complex are individually linked. So the tonal complex analysis, tonal alignment, tonal integrity, and tonal crowding, so explains the special linking behavior of super heavy syllables without having to try to analyze them away, which also means that there is no split syllable analysis, and we don't need to admit syllable types like nk with a syllable initial moraic nasal, which is unattested outside of the putative split syllable context. This kind of tonal complex analysis, if we look beyond the super heavies, it could give a window into the prosodic typology of Japanese accent systems. This is part of a NINJAL project, which is the National Institute for Japanese Language and Linguistics, whereby the typology of Japanese accent systems has been studied. There are at least three types that are sort of accentual. What's called the lowering accent kernel, HL, which can be analyzed as the tonal complex HL, ascending H star, or raising L star H, with this is the dialect map given by Uwado for all of these cases. The most of these are the lowering kernel, the ones that are the H star L cases. Okay. But by being able to analyze them into these tonal complexes, there may be a more interesting way of looking at the typology. So to conclude, instead of trying to analyze supersized units away, such as the oversized HL trochee or the super heavy syllables, we wanted to argue that it is often profitable to focus on the underlying constraints governing their behavior, which may provide a window on more fundamental aspects of phonological structure. Thank you very much.
I wanted to make sure that I understood the result. You, I think, show that the familiar observation that heavy light trochees are disfavored is correct, and that they only arise as a result of dominant constraints. That is, there is still no stress system that tries to construct heavy light trochees. There's no suffixes that have to go on a heavy stressed syllable. There is no trochaic lengthening, for example, right? So that's my first question. Just I wanted to understand if that's the case. The second is, I think super heavy syllables are different because there are cases where you try to make them, right? That's rather different from the heavy light trochee case. So, for example, in Finnish or Swedish, heavy syllables get super heavy when they're stressed, and you try to make the stressed syllables as long as you possibly can.
No, I think that's exactly right. So the heavy light trochee, as we try to show for English, there is still a constraint against that, and they are never the target. And this is just an interesting point. I think you are right.
About the super heavy
Yeah,
syllables,
it can be a target.
And I don't think it's a target. I don't think it's a target in Japanese, but I think that seems right.
So that's a continuation of Paul's question. Do you need to refer to foot structure in the analysis of English al or German schwa? Can't you simply say that both the suffix and the German schwa need to follow a stress?
For the English case, it should be a foot, right?
Why?
Because it doesn't necessarily just follow a no.
It follows a stress.
Like the case of Rama, let's say table Rama.
Oh,
right?
I have no idea about Rama. I'm talking about AL.
About AL.
Yes.
AL, but the result is I see. So
and the same thing for German schwa.
I think, the Rama case is definitely stronger, I think, to argue for a constituent in that case. And German schwa, but what is it what does a preceding heavy syllable help, just as such?
What does incorporation into a foot do for you?
Well,
so why that particular unit needs incorporation into a foot as opposed to leaving it outside metrical structure, which is of course also an option in the case of schwa sometimes.
Yes, but but interestingly, that doesn't happen, right, being outside of foot structure. So,
okay.
What do you think?
Well, there's a difference between the schwa inside. There's the schwa wants to be within the. There are unstressed syllables that are not within its schwas. But the schwas are always within a foot, I think.
In other words, they always follow stress.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
We see that, yes. Right.
So thank you. It's very interesting. I like the analysis where it's the fact that you have a contour tone that's linking, that's describing that systematic variation in the pronunciation. I'm wondering, at the end you showed the different dialects. Those also all had contour tones, but I believe there are some dialects in Japanese where there isn't a contour tone. So I think the Kagoshima dialect, for example, puts the high tone just on the final mora, and there's no following low, there's no contour tone at all. So in that case, you would expect that you wouldn't find, and I'm wondering if that's actually what happens.
That's definitely right. So these were not part of that big scale comparison. So there are dialects where the accent is probably just a single tone.
Right.
But this is just the threefold classification into these various kinds of kaku that Ueno had done. So there are other things.
Okay.
That's definitely
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah. Bruce?
I was fascinated by foot-tail, which is new to me. This is really just a data question about the general scope of the distribution of schwa in German. And it's two little thoughts that I had. So let me just give them both to you and then you can answer. So thought A is, my understanding is that German lacks words like, say, English Apalachicola, where you have these schwas right in the middle of the word.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And the other question is, doesn't German have words like Gesang or Befehl, where there's a schwa in the first syllable?
That's right. That would be another case where that schwa would not be dependent on a foot. for many styles of speech, like mine include, that schwa doesn't sound exactly like the schwa that's at the end. It's much more of a fuller vowel.
Like an epsilon, right?
It's more like so for me. But yeah, these words exist. Beamter, Gebet.
Okay, so why no Mississippi words in German? They obey schwa tail.
I don't know.
Isn't there words like hagedis in Dutch? Because Dutch is very similar, but you have medial schwas.
But don't they all have like kind of intermediate structure, a morphological structure?
No.
Well, I can't think, I mean...
Kalabas, hagedis, there are words like that. And German must have them too, I would think.
I have to think about it. You might be right.
For example,
What was it?
Kladderadatsch, yeah. So there are some forms like that, yeah.
Just a quick footnote to Donka's remark. I think the intuition might be that in German, the language is predominantly trochaic. So this is an extension of the trochaic foot of German. This therefore suggests a line of attack. Since the question is about grouping above and beyond prominence, one could look at a language which is manifestly iambic and then try to predict that no such thing could ever occur.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.